Yep, this is Andy B on the Get You Home show. The time is just got, it's nearly 5:05 now, 11th of March. This is the Get You Home show. My name's Andy B. You're very welcome to join me every day from 4 till 7. Now, regular listeners know that I love doing stories. Monday through Thursday afternoons, we have stories from all sorts of people from around the world. Some you recognise, like Dr. Richard Scott every Tuesday and Lord Jackson on a Thursday about sensory health. But Mondays and Wednesdays, we have different people coming on, which is really exciting. So today's guest is Dr. Rachael Pickering. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
Now, there's loads I want to get into to talk about what it is that you do. So because we've had a little chat earlier, but where would you want to start? Because we love learning about not just what people do, but how they got there and why they're doing that. What is it you do on a kind of daily basis?
Thank you for having me, Andy. I am a prison doctor, a GP, a general practitioner, and I work both in the UK and also in more financially challenged parts of the world.
So, I mean, that's going to conjure up a whole set of thoughts for people. We'll move on to the prison bit in a minute, but in terms of being a GP, what was your journey into that? Because although I chat to quite a few doctors now, I genuinely don't actually know how people become a GP today beyond doing quite well at school, probably a sort of a specialized degree that's a bit longer than normal, and then there's a GP thing. But what's the actual journey these days for that?
Well, okay, so for a general journey into general practice, which outside of the UK, most countries call family medicine specialists, what you would do is you would do quite well at school. In the UK, you'd have to get very good A levels. Then you apply to medical school, which is a special kind of university place. But the degree is twice as long. It's 6 years rather than 3. If you're training overseas, say in the States, then you'd have to do a pre-med college placement of about 3 years as well. But in the UK, you can go into medical school straight from school. Then as long as you pass the exams, you qualify as a junior doctor. And then you have 2 years of working under supervision as what's called a foundation doctor. And then at that stage, you can choose to apply for a special training. And so general practice has a 3-year vocational training scheme. And after 3 years, you've sit quite a few more exams. And then you graduate as a specialist in family medicine, which in the UK we call a GP. And then you've got to look for a job. Okay.
1 or 2 steps along the journey then?
Yes. And I took a more convoluted path. I did some other things along the way, but we can talk about that when we talk about, my journey.
Cool. So GP, family practitioner in the US, which is the only other version of the same thing that I know. Why a GP? Because obviously when you're training to be in medicine, there's surgery, there's consultancy, there's GP, and there's lots of different types, I suppose, of doctoring. Why did you end up down the route of GP?
Well, I didn't to start with. My husband, Mark, who I've been married for more than 30 years now. We met at church. We grew up in Hull together. And then we went to medical school, the same medical school, got married at medical school. He always knew he wanted to be a general practitioner. And he trained part-time in that alongside working part-time for the Christian Medical Fellowship, which he still works for. I trained originally in surgery and I worked full-time as a surgical trainee. And then I got and stayed pregnant. I had quite a lot of problems having pregnancies before that, and I didn't think that children was going to happen to me. So I didn't originally think about the whole, I'm a woman, I've got a family, and I'm going to be working very busy, long hours as a surgeon. I just didn't think that was going to be a real issue for me. I didn't think I'd ever stay pregnant. And then one day towards the end of the more junior part of your surgical training, I stayed pregnant. And it was a bit of a miracle, really, that happened and our daughter was born. And I thought, okay, so I took maternity leave, and then I realized that I had a big choice to make because it was quite obvious my daughter was autistic, and some people with autism, it is obvious from the age of a year, 18 months. Some people, it's not obvious until a bit later in their growing up. And with my daughter, she just did not settle in creche and with a childminder. My husband and I were splitting childcare duties and working part-time, but still she was very unhappy and not staying happily with the childminder. And so I had a big decision to make, and I decided after talking with my husband, and he actually was very generous. He said, no, you should train as a surgeon if that's what you want. I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. That's bones and joints, lots of hammers and drills and really cool bits of kit. But I decided actually, no, I wanted to retrain. So for myself, if I didn't have anyone else to consider, then, orthopedics all the way. But actually, I think God had a plan for my life, and the surgical training that I did do before I retrained as a general practitioner has not been wasted, because actually behind bars as a prison GP, especially overseas, being able to do minor surgery, being very good at joint injections, knowing what to do with fractures, old and new, abdominal injuries, that kind of thing, comes in extremely handy, because unfortunately prisoners often have quite violent episodes in their lives. And so you see a lot more of that than a GP in the community. So God didn't waste my training, but at the time I was personally quite heartbroken. But I took my CV along to the GP guru in London, where I was living at the time. And I said, here's me. What extra training would I need to become a GP? And it was a lot easier to retrain then, than it's more than 20 years ago, than it is now. You have to start all the way down at the bottom again now. But he said, oh, well, there's a hospice around the corner from you, and they're looking for their first GP trainee. You could work for them 3 days a week for, 10 months. And then, this doctor's wife needs a new GP trainee. She's just become a trainer. And I think you'd really get on along with her, because she used to be an anaesthetist and you used to be a surgeon. And that's a nice mix. So here it is. Go and do that. And I thought, oh, wow. And so there I was. A couple of years later, I came out the other side, having done the GP, what you call the exit exams, MRCGP. As a GP, a little bit older than some of the people who were also training alongside me, but not that much.
I mean, that is a route, and I love when people say, well, I did this thing, in your case, training for orthopedics, and then, well, I was really upset, but actually it's not wasted, because it comes back later. And it's one of my greatest privileges is when people are talking about that, because I can see the pain and the frustration of, they really liked that, but actually God had other plans, and of course it's not wasted. I have to ask, injections into joints. Now, not going into medical stuff necessarily, but why would you do that? What's that about?
Okay, so a joint is basically where two bones meet, and almost all joints will have a capsule around them. It's like a really tough medical football made out of fibrous tissue, which isn't bone. It's just protecting the ends of the joints and keeping them more or less together. And then that capsule generates some fluid. So you've got a little bit of a squishy mix going along around the joints, lubricating it and keeping it free from infection. But often joints can get painful, wear and tear of life. Sometimes there's been old infection, et cetera, et cetera. And so before you resort to anything drastic, like a joint replacement, a total hip replacement, a total knee replacement, these days, orthopedic surgeons can replace everything from shoulders down to joints in your fingers. But most people have heard of hip and knee replacements. Often in a knee, what you can do as a GP is you can inject some steroid into that joint, and it causes a bit of a flare-up in pain to start with, but then it often helps it settle down for a long while. And then there are some people who are very unfortunate and have diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, which is a disease of inflammation. It's nothing to do with wear and tear on the body as we get older. And so rheumatologists, that's joint specialist doctors who aren't surgeons, orthopedic surgeons and specially trained GPs will often inject those joints as well. Yeah.
I have this conversation. I chat with Dr. Richard Scott. I know he, a little bit.
Yes, I know him.
We're always saying, how did someone one day say this is a good idea? As simple as Fleming with moldy toast. Hey, we can cure all sorts of diseases. At some point, someone's got, hey, if we eat this moldy stuff, we're going to be better. There's that kind of how did someone work this out? Because it baffles me.
That's a very good question, and I don't actually know the answer. People have been injecting joints for a long while. The other thing that joint injections are useful is the reverse process. Rather than putting some steroid into it, you put a needle and syringe in, and then you draw out too much fluid if the joint's collecting too much fluid, or if it's been injured and it's got a lot of blood around it, you can take that out, and that really helps settle down the pain. I don't know when it started. We could look it up and maybe talk about it another time. But it's really cool thing to do, and it's quite satisfying to do. And that's just one way where my past training has come in handy. There's a phrase we have in medicine saying that with the retrospectoscope, doctors love scopes, little cameras that go inside of people, endoscopes. When you've got a bit of tummy trouble, we put a camera down your mouth, we put a camera up your bottom, a scope. But with the retrospectoscope, looking backwards in time, you can see that actually a patient had this condition or that condition. And it's the same with your career, whether or not you're in medicine or anything. Sometimes you can't see God's plan for your life until it's a good few years down the line. And then you look backwards and you see, oh, right, that makes sense.
Let's go into faith a little bit, because I want to come back to the prison part of doctoring. But where did faith enter your life then? Because you were talking about God's plans and so on, but where did faith become something for you that was really deeply personal?
Do you know, I was thinking about that. We had a little chat earlier on today, and I was thinking about that during this afternoon. Faith has always been personal to me, but I think in a slightly different way to most people. I'm not autistic. My daughter is diagnosed autistic, but I think as all parents of autistic children know, it has genetic tendencies, and my husband and I would both acknowledge that we have some traits towards being slightly black and white thinkers, not being overly emotional, that kind of thing, which again is helpful in prison medicine. I have not always felt very much in love with God every day. I remember as a child in church in Hull, as I said, I grew up in Hull, going to a community house church, and everyone else would be jumping up and down and sort of pogo dancing, we used to call it then, and sort of singing what I term slightly irreverently happy clappy songs about how great God is. And it would just leave me cold. And I just thought everyone was nuts and very emotional. And to me, that's not having a personal faith. That's how you express your personal faith. I've always expressed my personal faith a lot more sotoverse, a lot more quietly. I can't remember a time when I didn't believe that God existed. I had that quite fiercely contested at school. When my science teachers, I was very good at science at school. And, that a lot of them would say, we'd talk about evolution versus creationism, the discussion about intelligent design, that actually God and believing in God and believing in evolution are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That hadn't really come into scientific discussion so much when I was at school. But I remember having my faith quite fiercely challenged at school by people coming at it from a scientific angle. I can't ever remember a time when I decided that they were right and that God didn't exist. My parents were both Christians from when I was born. My parents were both evangelists, actually. They used to do evangelism on the Yorkshire beaches. I think it was called Christian Beach Mission or something like that. And they used to work with Youth for Christ as well. And my dad gave up his career as a maths teacher and then a computer programmer for IBM to become a full-time missionary. So I can't remember ever a time when Christianity and talking about around the dinner table, God, saying grace, having God in your life as a daily reality wasn't part of, it was always there. When do I remember it first becoming personal? I think I was probably 6 or 7 in my bedroom, and I was reading my Bible and had one of those children's Bibles, and realizing that actually God wanted a relationship with me as a person, and that God died for my sins, not just all of our sins. Oh yeah, that actually includes me as well. So I remember that very clearly. I can't remember a time when people say, when did you pray the sinner's prayer? I can't remember that. But I don't think that's important. I have accepted that Jesus died for my sins and that I need to live in accordance with his teaching as a result of what he's done for me. And that has been pretty consistent in my life since the age of, as I said, 6 or 7. There's been a few times when I really wish it wasn't true and that the rules in the Bible and what God says is good for us as humans were not there. When I went through not a massive rebellion streak as a teenager, but every teenager kicks against things a little bit. But yes, I've had a pretty orthodox life as a Christian, I would say. Yeah.
So faith, obviously you just said that's been part of you since you were born, effectively, all the way through. You talk about faith in terms of your plans to be a GP. You enjoyed school, and then you retrained to be a GP. How did you go from being a GP into being a GP in prisons? Because I don't quite understand how you can go and do that, because it feels like it's a completely different thing. And yet in my head, I know it's not that different. It's being a doctor in a different environment. But how did you find yourself there?
Sure. Okay, I'll just rewind a little bit. So I never thought I would actually do medicine. We just talked a few minutes ago about how you become a doctor. All doctors have to go to medical school. So you need to be making your mind up in the UK. Now, actually, you can do graduate entry programs. You can do another degree or do something else in life and then say, I'd like to go to medical school. But back in the early 90s when I went, you couldn't really do that. So you have to make the decision during sixth form, which seems a bit crazy, really, doesn't it, to be making such a serious decision at that age. But I actually didn't want to do that. I wanted to study pure mathematics. And I changed my mind at the very last minute, about a week before the applications could no longer be changed. And I would say there's only been about 3 times in my life when I've heard God speak to me. I'm one of those Christians who kind of politely makes fun of other Christians who's always having dreams and visions and seeing, visions of God in their cornflakes in the morning. That just isn't me. But I was sitting in my bedroom. I'd just been chatting to a friend. I'd put the phone down. And then I was just thinking, actually, I've done all my homework. I'm a bit bored tonight, unusual. And I just heard a voice saying, study medicine. Become a doctor. And I just thought, where did that come from? I had never thought about it. My mum was a nurse many years before, but she'd never pushed it on me. She hadn't told me lots of medical stories. So that was really, really freaky. And I went down and I spoke to my mum and I said, I've just heard this voice. And she knows I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to, hearing from God. And she was so thrilled. And she said, I've always known that this is what God would want to do, but I've never pushed it on you because I didn't want you to think I was pushing you into it. So I've just been praying along those lines. So I changed my application, applied to the only medical school that I could see a flyer for on the careers table, somehow got an interview and got a place, even though I hadn't got biology A-level, which at the time was compulsory. So I took that as a sign that I was meant to be in medical school. They sent me an A-level textbook in biology to read during the summer holidays. And then I had to turn up a week early and just sort of cram 2 years of biology into a week with a lovely old professor, Prof. Bannister. So, yeah, I was pretty sure God wanted me to be a doctor. And I decided on surgery because I actually really enjoyed it. And I love, doing things quite aggressively to joints. And that was just fun. General practice, I didn't really have good mentors in, particularly at medical school. So maybe I just didn't see it at the time as being as wonderful as it could be. But as I said, I mainly changed for family reasons. But I was so disappointed once I finally got we call it a CCT, Certificate of Completion of Training. I'm a consultant in family medicine. I'm known in the UK as a GP. And you have to look for a job. And I was so gutted because my CCTing coincided with the government changing contracts for doctors who own surgeries called partners. And partners employ in the UK nurses, receptionists, cleaners, and they can also choose to employ other doctors and call them salaried GPs. And then your boss is the partners. And all of a sudden it became really lucrative to be a partner. And so the number of partnerships to replace retiring partners just went through the floor. And instead, the remaining partners were choosing to employ more salaried doctors. And I was really gutted because I like to have control and a say in how things are run. I'm not, like a dictator or anything, but, I wanted to be a partner rather than to be salaried. And I just thought, oh no, I've gone to all this effort to retrain and now there's no job that I will enjoy. What am I going to do? So I decided to become a locum. And the practice where we were actually registered as a family, I had to take my daughter along too. I'd never been there before because we'd only recently moved into that practice. And my daughter had croup, and the GP I was seeing, he was really lovely. And he said, "I recognise you. Haven't I given you a lecture?" I said, "Yes, I've just been on the local training scheme. You lectured me on this." He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "So are you locuming now?" That's being self-employed to fill in for gaps. And I said, "Yes, I am. I'm locuming." He said, "We're desperately short. The locum that we booked for our senior partner's sabbatical cover, he was going to have a month off after 7 years there. He's just let us down, this locum, and we don't know what to do. He goes away next week. Could you possibly help?" I said, "Well, you're not really meant to work where you're sort of, registered as a patient." He said, "It's okay. It's an emergency. Can you do it?" And I said, "Okay." So they didn't really tell me anything else about the job, and perhaps they should have done, because it turned out that I was seeing a lot of very aggressive, very rude, very volatile people, a lot of substance misuse, that's drugs and alcohol, a lot of mental health problems, very high illiteracy, no jobs, clientele. And there was a big perspex sheeting up in front of the receptionist, and there was a security guard in the waiting room. And that was almost unheard of at the time, even in accident and emergency rooms. Now it's quite commonplace in A&Es, emergency departments, but it wasn't then. And that should have given me a hint that I was in a fairly unusual situation. But I got on with the job. And then after that doctor came back, and they had me back to cover somebody else, I finally met this doctor. He was lovely, Dr. McCullough. And he said to me, "Did you enjoy caring for my patients?" And I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Had you seen that they're a bit different from most GP patients?" I said, "I was going to ask." He said, "Well, our practice has a contract to care for patients who, for reasons of violence or otherwise unacceptable behaviour, have been removed from other GP practices' books. And I'm the one who sees them because I can handle those kind of people." And I said, "Oh, how comes that?" He said, "Because I'm a police doctor, what used to be called a police surgeon. Now we say forensic physician, in the evenings and weekends." I said, "Oh, right. That's really cool." He said, "Would you like a job?" And I thought he meant at the practice. And he said, "No, unfortunately, we haven't got a vacancy for a salaried GP. But I do work in a team of 12 for the London Police, the Metropolitan Police. And at least one person on that team of 12 has to be a woman. But we're having a really hard time finding a woman who's clinically competent and able to hack the kind of patients that we have to see, all the aggression and bad words and, argy-bargy." He said, "Would you like to have a go?" So that Friday, I found myself down my local police station, and I still remember it like a photo. As I walked in, there was a fight going on the floor. There was a police sergeant sailing over the desk to help with restraining somebody. There was an almost naked man who was roaring and tearing this big book, it looked like a telephone book or something like that, apart. And I just thought, wow, he's super strong. And then there was some police officers who brought in massive evidence bags full of skunk, and the smell of it was just overwhelming. And the doors were clanging shut, all the big metal gates, and there were alarms going off and radios. And my colleague turned to me, he said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm absolutely fine." And I felt this most enormous peace come over me, because I realized that this is where God wanted me to spend my career, behind bars. And it's only a few years earlier, while we were still at medical school, my husband and I had been at a Christian medical students conference that the Christian Medical Fellowship still run every February. And there'd been a mission speaker talking about his life as a medical missionary. And both my husband and I had felt called that actually God wanted us to do some kind of mission work, but we hadn't known what country or what discipline. So we decided just to wait for God to make it clear. And it was in that moment, really, he made it clear. It was working behind bars. And the rest is history.
I was going to say that there's a baptism of fire,
Yeah.
And then there's multiple baptisms of fires going on at the same time. I mean, if you are going to get, I suppose, the worst of that environment, that's kind of it. If you're okay with that moment, like you said, you had this piece, which I want to come back to in a moment, quite clearly, evidently, you're thinking, hey, I'm okay. This is where I think, obviously, God wants me to be.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people, doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals behind bars in jails, we have physios, OTs, mental health nurses, healthcare assistant, carers who do washing and caring for people who are prisoners who are too frail to care for themselves, opticians, audiologists, you name it, we have it. But a lot of them worry an awful lot about coming to work behind bars. Yes, there are risks. Yes, in 20 years, I have been clobbered a few times. But actually, that's happening in the community. Doctors in general practice are increasingly talking. We have online messaging boards, and increasingly you're seeing community GPs saying, I got hit last week. Somebody, locked me into my consulting room, wouldn't let me leave until I'd done what they wanted. A&E nurses and doctors are frequently threatened, assaulted. Paramedics in the community are often assaulted. So in some ways, actually being in jail is a lot safer because I've got a whistle, there are panic buttons everywhere, and there are officers, liberally scattered around who, you call and they come very, very quickly. So in some ways, it's actually safer if you're going to work with a risky population,
I wanted to come back to the peace because there's this bit of the Bible that talks about the peace that transcends all understanding. And what did that mean to you? How can you explain as best as you can something that we can't explain? But how would you best explain that peace in the moment of that utter chaos? A place where many people would be listening and feeling afraid. How would you describe the peace that you felt at that moment in that police station?
Oh, it was quite surreal. I think when you have an experience that incongruous, out of place with what your psyche, predictable human behavior would say you should feel in that situation, then I would put a supernatural explanation on that and say that that's God telling you something. You do get some people, we had a medical student I was showing around jail just a few weeks ago. They'd come for the day from one of the London medical schools, and I would say they were just being a bit of a klutz. They were not listening to their emotions. That was telling them, actually, the doctor's walking out of this room, the patient's flaring up, you should be following suit. And so I actually had to get hold of their arm and say, come on, engage brain, it's time to leave. But most humans, if you engage your brain, we've got emotional intelligence that tells us whether or not the situation is A-OK or uber risky. And so if you have a good degree of emotional intelligence, which I think I do have, and women doctors actually make very good prison GPs because we have a very high EQ. Generally, men can as well, but women doctors tend to have a higher level of emotional intelligence and can pick up on things that patients are feeling, and also risks that are coming up more quickly. But yeah, I would say that the intellectual part of my brain is saying, this is dangerous. And the spiritual part of my being is saying, this is your mission field that you've been called to, just chill. So surreal.
Yeah, it's surreal is good. I've read various stories. People like David Wilkerson, who found himself in places where people are actually taking drugs in front of him and heroin, and yet he knew this is where God's calling him to be. And there's lots of stories of that.
Yeah, and David Wilkerson, The Cross and the Switchblade. If anyone's not read it, brilliant book, fabulous film. I think the vibe given over in the film, and I think is true to a degree, is that he was not the most streetwise young pastor, was he? I would say that perhaps is another thing that God was preparing me for. I grew up in Hull. I went to state schools. Quite a lot of the lads that I went to school alongside have done jail time. In fact, I've actually seen one of them as my patient, although he didn't recognize me. It's just one of those names that you remember, very, very distinctive name. And there he was, looking no different, just a bit older and grayer. And wow, I was at school with you. But yeah, quite a lot of the people I've been at school with have done jail time. I wasn't brought up in the rough end of Hull, but I had a fairly streetwise upbringing compared to your average medical student that went to medical school in the early 1990s. Thankfully, these days, medical schools are being a bit more savvy about the kind of people that they're recruiting. Same with nursing and other disciplines. And we're looking for people who've got more life experience and are not so snobby and posh. But I think the fact that I had a fairly streetwise upbringing gave me an advantage when it comes to working behind bars, in that, yes, I can be very professional, but I've also got a bit of an edge I can put on when I need to. I don't dissolve into tears the first time somebody starts using the F word, etc., etc. Yeah.
So effectively then, in a prison context, okay, you've got locked doors around you, but it is literally the same basic job of all sorts of illnesses coming your way.
Yes, so prisoners in the UK have a right to what's called equivalence of care. In fact, it's an international standard now, where it's agreed that prisoners should have the same basic rights to healthcare as free people in the community. Yes, that might have to be delivered in a slightly different way, but they should have the same standard of care. I'll give you an example of that. So if I was to refer, say I was doing a session in the community and I was subbing in for your GP, and you came to see me and I decided that you needed an ultrasound of your kidney, then I would fill out a form either on the computer or on a bit of old-fashioned paper, and you'd be sent along to the local hospital to have your kidney ultrasounded. But in prison, I did one of these just on Monday. I decided a prisoner needed an ultrasound of his kidney, and I put him on an electronic waiting list, because once a month we have an ultrasonographer who brings his kit into prison, and he can ultrasound everything apart from really specialist stuff like hearts. So the service comes to the prisoner. So that's not equal care, but it's equivalent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it was in 2006, the state took over healthcare in prisons and took it away from the Ministry of Justice and gave it to the Department of Health, and it became part of the NHS. And at that point, all prison medical officers who were not actually fully qualified by British standards, general practitioners, they had to retire. So that now, whether or not it's you in the community or a prisoner in prison, you should be getting the same standard of qualification from your doctor and your nurse as well, which is a great thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's good. I've had this conversation a few times at home. If someone's in a prison, they are now in care of the state. However, you want to reference that, and there's lots of very emotive opinions on this. But as soon as that gavel comes down in the courtroom, and okay, you're going to prison, now the state is taking responsibility for that person's life. And we've decided as a nation, okay, that means you're going to go to prison, and there's various types of those, and you'll stay in prison for how many weeks, years, months, whatever. But we have a duty of care to that person, because now they can't seek their own help. They can only get help from the one person that's put them there.
Absolutely. So, if you started having chest pains tonight and your loved ones were all out and your phone didn't work and you couldn't call a taxi, you could probably still press the emergency function 999 and an ambulance would take you to A&E, or you'd stumble out into the street and a neighbour would take you. Prisoners do not have that autonomy. They are entirely dependent on whoever answers the buzzer and hoping the buzzer works in their cell. So, we have a duty. The more you restrict somebody's liberty, the more we have a duty of care. So somebody who's in the British equivalent of, we call it segregation. Most of the rest of the world calls it solitary confinement. But that's an ultra-restricted part of prison. And people there are banged up for at least 22 hours a day. And they don't commune with other prisoners. They are even more vulnerable than prisoners on the main part of the prison, who are in turn more vulnerable than you and me. So the greater the degree of restriction that you put on somebody, the greater degree of responsibility you have for them. A bit like how we view children. We would say that we have a greater duty of care to our children who are under 18 than we do for our adult children, wouldn't we? Once you've grown up and left home, to a certain degree, you're on your own, kid. We still care about them more than we do strangers. But so prisoners, it's really important that we grasp that when a judge sentences you to prison, either on remand to await trial or as a sentence, that the judge, he or she, is not saying, I sentence you to 15 years of, deprivation of liberty and deprivation of decent healthcare. The only thing you're sentenced to is deprivation of liberty. And actually, one of the aims of imprisonment, certainly in the British system, is rehabilitation. So deprivation of liberty is partly a punishment for the prisoner, partly a safety measure for the public if it's something that's risky, such as murder or rape. but partly it's also rehabilitation. And as a doctor in prison, one of the greatest joys I have is that if I can make a small improvement to somebody's often quite profound health needs, maybe just as simple as diagnosing them with asthma or giving them an asthma inhaler. They know they've got asthma, but they have not had an asthma inhaler in years because they've never been in one place long enough to register with a GP and get it, or maybe they left it at the last place before they went on the run. If I can just give them an inhaler and say, here you go, then they're not so short of breath that they can't get up the stairs. If they can get up the stairs, they can go to education and they can get their GCSE in English or maths. Then maybe they can read and write well enough to go to education and learn why it is that doing the things that they were convicted of is wrong. And education is power. We know that people who engage with the rehabilitation side, the educational side of prison, they have a much lower rate of what's called recidivism, which is posh speak for doing the same crime or a similar crime again and becoming what you call a revolving door prisoner. In, out, in, out, in, out, in, out. It's heartbreaking when you see people who are coming in and out. If we can improve their health, they are more able to help themselves and cooperate with the state. And that's better for everyone. It's better for society. So it's also economically, it makes massive sense. So why wouldn't you want to put good healthcare into prisons? It's an absolute no-brainer.
And now, I think most of us would be fairly in tune with the idea that doctors quite often go abroad and do something. I think every doctor I've ever spoken to, at some point in their career, maybe for a summer or a semester, or 5 years, has gone abroad and done something. I know Rich has been, who we know has been across and done some things, and so on and so forth. So it's not uncommon for doctors and nurses and dentists to spend some of their time abroad every year or for a season. How have you found yourself going abroad? What took you on that particular path?
Really good question. Again, it was prison medicine. So in 2010, I was working for a police force, and the police force decided to outsource their employment, and they wanted us instead to work for this locum agency. My colleagues and I looked at it. What was being proposed, police medicine, by the way, is the only part of medicine that's still outside. Well, immigration centres, it's commissioned through the Home Office, but police medicine, there is currently a big problem with standards and minimum qualifications for doctors and nurses, and that's still a current hot potato, shall we say. But just leaving that aside, we decided that what we were being asked to do was not a quality setup and that we wouldn't work for it, so we all resigned. And I decided that the next time the contract came up for renewal, I wanted to win that contract. So my husband and I and a colleague, we formed a not-for-profit, a community interest company, which are really popular these days, aren't they, for everything from running libraries through to, all kinds of things. We started a community interest company called Integritas Healthcare. Integritas is the Latin and Greek word for integrity. And we wanted to provide high quality, good value healthcare behind bars. And what we were thinking was, this police contract, the next time it comes up, we want to put in a really good value bid and win it. But we didn't imagine that, we would be doing other things with it. But God obviously had other ideas. Very quickly after that, we were asked to run the GP provision for a high secure prison, majoring in sex offenders up in the north of England, which we did. And that suddenly generated a lot of money coming in because the contract, even though we didn't ask for more money, had all this extra money built into it. And one of the things with community interest companies is you cannot just put the money in the bank and watch it grow. You've either got to spend it on assets or give it away to nominated organisations. So the end of the year was coming up, and I thought, oh gosh, we're going to have a bit of a problem here. What are we going to do with all this money? This is great. By the way, since the pandemic's come, that's a completely different situation. We have to pray for absolutely every penny, day in, day out. But back then, at the beginning, we were relatively well financed. And my mum was watching this documentary about Russian prisons. My mum loves to watch documentaries about prisons because her daughter works in them. And she invited me to watch alongside with her. And it was my birthday, actually. And I was watching and saw the most horrific things. And it's a country about Russia has state prison doctors, but they also have an extremely high level of human rights abuses. And the things I saw on there, I just suddenly thought, wow, Russia is sort of Europe, Eurasia. That's really bad. And then I suddenly thought, I wonder how many countries in the world don't actually have any state provision. Russia has it, really bad provision, but it does have it. Which countries don't have anything? Which countries like Russia have doctors who are collaborating in really nasty things happening to their prisoner patients and not standing up for them? And so I had a medical student staying with me, and I asked her to do a bit of research. And she went off and she came back with some very frightening statistics. And at the same time, I was having a really bad nightmare, a really bad dream about being ill-treated myself, very badly beaten, naked, hungry, thirsty, in a lot of pain, being in a prison cell, really, really hot, begging for someone to help me, banging on the door. And yet when somebody did come to help me, I was really afraid as the door answered. And I was having this recurring nightmare every night. And as I said, watched this documentary, got the answers from this student who'd done the research, that actually many countries in the world have either very unethical doctoring behind bars or have nothing at all provided by the state. And can you imagine what that must be like to be deprived of your liberty in horrific conditions, far worse, far worse than anything we have in British prisons, and not to have any medical help? And I suddenly thought, maybe that's what God wants us to do with the money. And it came back to me that, God called my husband and I to do medical mission. And yes, you could argue that doing it as a paid job in British prisons and police stations is a mission field in itself. Not all missionaries have to be unpaid. But, was this actually an untapped medical mission field abroad that somebody who is now an expert in prison medicine could do? And so we started looking for a collaboration with a church overseas. We narrowed it down to 5 countries, put out a lot of feelers, decided on the Philippines as a base for a year. We went and did some research, and then we put in a project for a year. It was going really well after a year. And so we decided to stay. We bought a base out there. And it's been 11 years now that we've been based in the Philippines. We have to be known as a slightly different name there, Integridad, which is the Spanish and Tagalog, their local word for integrity, Integridad Heart for detainees. We employ some local staff, and we have doctors and students from overseas who come and help. And that takes me overseas 3 or 4 times a year. And one of the greatest joys is to take medical students and nursing students on their elective, which is towards the end of your student time as a medical student, a nursing student, a physio student. You get the opportunity to spend 6 to 12 weeks abroad or in a different culture in the UK, doing medicine in a different way. And it's just amazing to be able to take them and show them, what it is to show respect and to give dignity to people who really are in extreme dire straits. And it's amazing the difference that's made in those students' lives, because they then come back to the NHS and other high-income countries with a different heart for people who are at the bottom end of the social heap. And even if they never become prison doctors themselves, I don't really care, as long as they're treating people as God would have us treat each other. Love your neighbour as yourself. And as it says in Matthew 25:36, I was sick and in prison, and you came to visit me. And Jesus said, people who you treat people like that, it's as if you're treating God. You disregard people who are in prison, who are naked, who are homeless, who are hungry, who are thirsty. If you disregard them and you ignore their pleas for help, God regards it as if you disregard him. And I think that's a very serious thing. So we've got Matthew 25:36, I was sick and in prison and you visited me, as our sort of biblical strapline for our NGO, if you like. Use it all the time in teaching. It's a wonderful verse. Yeah.
It is important that we don't forget people who are the most vulnerable. There are loads of scriptures like that. Often we think about children. That's kind of where our brain easily goes. But the most vulnerable are not just children. So, I mean, in the UK, that's under 18s. They are legally children. But there are all sorts of people, including the widows and the widowers. And then you've got prisoners who are most vulnerable because they are literally at the mercy of people who they cannot fight against because it's never in their interest to do so in the first place. But they do deserve dignity. And this is one of the things that's always struck me. It doesn't matter what someone's been accused of doing. I know our human hearts can get very angry and emotional about certain offenses and all the rest of it. But that person right there is, as hard as it is to say sometimes, they're still a child of God. They're still made in God's image. And whatever they may have done, we're not perfect, any of us. So we have to be very careful how we sort of label or accuse folk like that.
Absolutely. I have rarely come across a prisoner or a police detainee to whom I had a sort of emotional revulsion. It does happen. I've met plenty of doctors and nurses who feel that it's very difficult to treat somebody who is a paedophile, especially the more notorious ones. Or I worked with a doctor who'd done some army service in the past, and he found it very difficult when we were asked to care for somebody who'd killed a soldier. We all have our touch points, which touch us more emotionally. But actually, I think, again, maybe it's God's preparation for me having a life behind bars. I'm a bit of a feminist. In fact, I'm a lot of a feminist. In my own life and in how I seek to empower other women, I get very angry a lot of the time when I see women being downtrodden by men. But somehow, when I see those men on the other side of the bars, and they've done horrific things to their girlfriends, they've raped women, they've done terrible things to the opposite sex, I just feel sympathy for them, because I have rarely come across a prisoner, once you actually get to know them and read a bit about what's been going on in their lives and care for them. I've rarely met somebody who hasn't had some form of abuse or serious trauma in their own lives, usually when they were boys. Not always. I'm sure there are plenty who haven't, but most of people who commit nasty crimes, something has gone very horribly wrong with them when they were young themselves. Maybe they've seen their dad abusing their mother. Maybe they've witnessed all kinds of traumas, sexual or otherwise, or had it done to them. And we should be very careful before we start casting stones. We are not individual domestic units. We are a society, and we are responsible for each other. I very much like, I don't know if any of the listeners have seen An Inspector Calls. It's you can see it on Netflix and BBC iPlayer. It's an adaptation of a play that was written about 100 years ago. And it talks about how, we injure people as a society. One person does one thing and then another person does something else to them and another person does something else to them. We are responsible for each other. So before we judge by what we read on the news, we should really get to know people. And even if somebody is the most evil sounding person in the world, God still sent Jesus to die for them. In fact, they're in more need of his grace than we are. And as a Christian doctor, I want my patient to know that God loves him or her, and being all holier than thou and righteous with them and making them feel bad is not exactly going to be a very good gospel messenger, is it? So it's very important to just treat them like anybody else. And I'm really happy that I can share my faith a lot behind bars, because prisoners, although they probably will contest that they're guilty of the thing that put them behind bars right here and now, most prisoners, people who are sort of professional criminals, they don't ever contest the fact that they're a bad boy, And so the concept of sin, of offending God, is not something that offends them per se. And you can have really good conversations with people about God's grace and about salvation. It's great.
Thank you, Rachel. If people are curious more about what you're doing as a prison doctor, I know if you've mentioned Integritas, which is there's a website which you've put out. How do people contact you to that if that's something they feel they should be doing?
Oh, thank you. It's www.integritas, Integritas, healthcare.com. churchgroups.org. We have a website. We have 5 services: healthcare, expertise, advocacy, research and training, and our contact details are all over it. I'm very happy to talk to church groups, secular groups, anybody at all. We take volunteers of all faiths and none, including people who aren't healthcare professionals. So we're always looking for donations because, as I said, the pandemic wiped out our funding in more ways than one. So we're in the process of switching from becoming a community interest company to a registered charity. So we'd appreciate prayers for that. We're always in need of financial support and donations of medical goods as well. But yeah, have a look on the website, and if you want to know more or you think you can help us, please get in touch. Love to hear from you.
Dr. Rachael Pickering, thank you for joining me today. Just talking through some of this stuff. I think prisons are places where we really do need to be very seriously concerned for what's going on behind the bars. These are people who, whether they've done something wrong and accepted it or not, they still desire our care and our compassion. That can be a really bitter pill to swallow. However, it doesn't take away exactly what you were talking about from the Bible, that we need to be caring for these people, because when we do, Jesus is watching. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Did you know that at Pure 24/7 Radio, we also offer advertising? Advertising really does work. Let's face it, you're listening to this. Want to know more? Well, just go to pure247radio.org, pure247radio.org/advertising, and you can get everything you want and more there.